So, yeah, just first of all, this is really going to focus around the definition of whole grain foods and just some of the issues around that. It sounds really boring. I admit, probably for starters, we're going to talk about definition of whole grain foods, but it actually encapsulates a lot of the issues that you need to think about, especially if you're going to focus exactly as Dana was saying about this gap between recommendations for what people should be eating for whole grains and what people actually eat. So just very briefly, just geography. Between us, there's a lot of sea. So you're based over here, and I'm sitting here it's Thursday for you and it's Friday for me. So there's this magical line somewhere along here that the day suddenly changes. So I can assure you that Friday is not too different to Thursday, although I've probably got another about 4 hours before I can start my weekend, and you have about another 24. So I'm living in a place called Lincoln. It's just outside the city of Christchurch. And this is a traditional grain growing area. So we have a wide variety of grains that have been grown. Those of you with more agricultural bent probably should note that due to commodity prices, a lot of farmers have converted into dairying. So there's actually a lot less grain grown, a lot more milk grown, which presents some particular problems for the soil and for water quality. But again, that's another topic. But traditionally, this has been an area that's very strong in growing wheat in particular. And so from today, I want you to sort of come away getting an idea why definitions, not just whole grain definitions, why food definitions are important. It can seem to be a very dry topic and people quibble about seemingly small things, but they are really important for everyone, from food manufacturers and food suppliers through to the consumer. But also within that, why they're so complicated. Why can't we just improve regulations and make things stronger to make them, for healthy food recommendations? It's a lot more complicated than that. And then also just to maybe get people thinking about how whole grain intake could be increased, because that's ultimately what a lot of us are trying to do. And so we're going to just get things started, and some of this should be pretty basic, but it's just, I guess, to get away from the usual Zoom fatigue. So we're just going to start off with 3 different polls, and Sean, not sure if you'll be able to just guide me through. But first of all, the first question we've got is just which of these 9 pictures or types of foods would you say are whole grain cereals? Okay, so it's not rocket science. It should be pretty easy. Here comes the poll.
And this will just be question 1 on your poll. You'll see 9 options on your screen for just question 1.
So we've got number 1 is enriched white wheat flour. Number 2 is whole grain wheat berries. Number 3, whole grain wheat flour. 4 is quinoa. 5 is corn or maize. 6 are linseeds. 7 are kidney beans. 8 soya beans, and 9 peanuts.
And Alastair, I think I may have just realized that with the way the poll is set up, we might not be able to end it without people selecting 3 questions, unfortunately. Okay. So I think that's what I'm starting to see with some of the people completing the poll, is they're kind of filling out 2 and 3. We will get to question 2 and 3 in these coming slides as well. Okay. So,
all good. Okay. So see some answers coming through. So just we can see the percentage of people participating. So we're at 22% or 25%. Let's give it another 30 seconds. Right. Only 11 out of 27. Okay, well, we'll call it there just to save on that awkward silence. And so I see that most people chose number 2, whole grain wheat berries. That's absolutely correct. They are also whole grains. And fortunately, nobody's chosen peanuts as whole grains because that was really there just to make sure that you're not just clicking everything. Peanuts, of course, are nuts. They're not cereal grains at all. One which may come up in the composition discussion, but linseeds, kidney beans, and soybeans are not cereal grains, so they are not at all related to the cereal family. Their composition is quite different from what you would expect for cereals. So these are actually not included in any definitions of whole grains. Of course, enriched white wheat flour is not a whole grain either. So whole grain wheat berries, whole grain wheat flour, quinoa, and corn are all types of whole grains. Quinoa should be noted is not a true cereal either, but it's called a pseudo cereal, and sneaks in there just on that basis as a whole grain. So very good. So move to the next question, and this one is just looking at these breads, 6 breads. Just quickly see if you pick the one which you think has the most whole grain. So bread 1, bread 2, bread 3, bread 4, bread 5, bread 6 are all types of brown breads. Which ones do you think might be containing the most whole grain? Bearing in mind here that visual cues, unless something's written down, are really the only way that we can try and work out whole grain content. So in this case, we might have had a bit of double. So you need to scroll down to question 2 in the polling. All right, so we've got to nearly 50% who've participated. So we've had a couple of people have chosen bread number 1 here. Otherwise, bread number 6 was the main choice. And just to illustrate, it's actually really hard to tell based just visually without having something written down how much whole grain is present. But actually, it's bread number 1 that has the most whole grain, and that was around about 50% whole grain of these breads. So just want to illustrate here that visual cues, while they're really important, don't necessarily tell all of the whole story. So we go down now to question 3. So in your poll, just scan down to question 3. It's a multiple choice one. This is just really a question about wording. And so of these breakfast cereals, the boxes, which ones do you think should be classified as a whole grain breakfast cereal? So we've got a box with a label on it saying made with whole grains. And we've got another box that's got whole grain breakfast bites, another one named or labeled as multigrain breakfast bites, and then the final one is sugar puff whole grain breakfast bites. And so this is not which one tastes, or you think would taste best, but which ones do you think should be counting as whole grains? Which ones do you think would be whole grain? So if you just go down all the way down to question 3, we're getting some quite different answers here. So all of them are getting answered as potentially being whole grain, but most people seem to think that box number 2 is most likely, well, should be the one that is definitely going to be whole grain. Number 4 with sugar puff whole grain breakfast bites. So we'll come back to that issue later on. But there's no right or wrong answer here. This is just a case of labeling, but how labels can deliver quite different messages, and this is again why definitions are really important. Okay, so thank you very much for all those who've participated, and that's quite it's a good wee exercise to try something else in Zoom. Now, I just wanted to start off really with some grounding truths, if you like, as much as in science we never talk about the truth. It's what we're always trying to find out. But effectively, in terms of nutrition science, it is very clear that people who eat the most whole grains compared to who eat the least have much lower risk of many diseases, cardiovascular diseases, some types of cancer, obesity, also some evidence around type 2 diabetes and things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is really consistent, far more consistent than the research on, for example, fruit and vegetables. And nobody would deny that it's important to eat more fruit and vegetables. The evidence for whole grains is far stronger. We really, really need to get people worldwide eating more whole grains instead of refined grains, exactly as Nana started off with. It's really an urgent public health measure. There are many, many reasons for it, but the basic understanding is that whole grains are far better for your health than refined grains. So just to start off with that, so that we all kind of know the direction we should be going in. And if we look at national nutritional recommendations for whole grain intake, we can see that just from the countries where it is absolutely specifically stated for whole grains, they are saying eat more whole grains, or at least half of your whole grains. In the United States, it's half of your daily grains as whole grains. Other countries such as the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden, they actually talking about very specific amounts. Or, for example, in Australia, they talk about mostly whole grain cereals. So this is what the nutritional recommendations are in many countries. And it is quite clear. Again, this just supports that overall picture that for good health, we should be eating more whole grains and replacing refined grain foods with whole grains. Then, if you just look at what people are actually eating, so we bear in mind that, for example, in the United States, if you're going to be choosing half of your grain servings as whole grains, you're talking around about 48 grams per day. Whereas in actual fact, the estimated intake is around 16 grams per day. That's, of course, it's an average. So some people will be eating, a few people will be eating a lot more, and many, many people will be eating none. And around the world, we see that there's a lot of variation. In some Asian countries, it's also similarly low. Southern Europe, where there's a strong refined wheat culture, especially France and Italy, it's very low. We get into the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, intake there is around about 50 grams. So what is below what they recommend, but around about the level that's recommended in the United States. So just to give you a bit of an idea of that gap between what is recommended and what is actually being eaten. Now, we come to definitions, and so the focus of this discussion is really around whole grain food definitions, but before we can really get there, you need to get onto a whole grain definition. So what is a whole grain? And again, I think you'll be covering this in more detail, but effectively it's, as you think, it's the cereal grain with all the three main constituents present, so the bran, endosperm, and the germ. And with refining, you mill away the outer bran layer and also take away the germ. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, and again, I think I'm not going to repeat what will be covered later on. And you think that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? You take a grain and you mill it and you don't take anything away, but actually the milling process is far more involved and complicated than that. Most mills will actually, in effect, remove the outer 1 to 2% of the grain, so they're the very outer parts of the bran, and that gets rid of lots of the contaminants. So you think about that's where all the nasty things, heavy metals and pesticides or herbicides or whatever's been added to the grains, that's where they're all sitting. That's a very easy way of getting rid of those things. It's just take the very, very outer parts of it. Pretty much all modern milling processes also, they split the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. So stone mills, of course, they keep everything together, but most mills will actually separate them out. And so you've got this idea of recombination versus reconstitution. And so most millers will actually do recombination, and that's when they just take a whole lot of grains, and they'll separate them out into the bran, the endosperm and the germ, and then they'll mix them together in internationally accepted ratios of what would be expected. There's something called reconstitution, which is when you just take the components, you separate them, and then you add them back together from the same batch. But in actual fact, most millers are doing recombination. And so if you think about all the research around whole grains and health, that is based on principally recombined flour, foods made from recombined flour. There are also questions around, things like ultrafine milling techniques. So standard milling grinds the particles down to a very small size, but there are sort of superfine milling techniques which make these even smaller. And we really don't know if this has an impact on downstream physiological effects of the grains. Similarly, for things like processing, germination, related to that malting, can you add enzymes to the flour to alter the properties? Is it still a whole grain then? And again, as mentioned before about pseudo cereals, you've got these grains which are not technically cereals, but used much in the same way as cereals, should they be included. So something that should be really straightforward and there is broad agreement on, you start to see quite a bit of complexity. And part of that is, I guess, that academic understanding of food, meeting the reality of modern food production. And that there needs to be some sort of balance and understanding between the two. So when we then get to whole grain foods, it's a lot more complicated. And the reason is just the sheer diversity of foods produced from cereal grains. I mean, cereal grains are wonderful because they're so versatile. You can do lots of different things with them. And around the world, there's pretty much every culture will have some form of cereal-based food. It's what it's allowed humanity to expand beyond the hunter-gatherer society. And you can do so much. And of course, along with that, it makes it much harder, though, to come up with a definition that's going to cover all the different bases and the different traditions and different cultures. So, we have all these different kinds of labels that you'll see on food products, which say, whole grain is a first ingredient, made with whole grains, things like team whole grain, whatever that means. It's Danish for choose whole grains first. All these different messages that you can get on packages, which tell you that this product contains whole grains. But do we all have a common understanding what it means? And that's where things get really complicated. So you've got things like the United States organization, the Old Ways Whole Grain Council, having this kind of process on how you should identify whole grain products. And so, if it's got these words on the package, yes, these words, it might be. And if it's got these particular words like wheat germ or enriched flour, no, these words never describe whole grains. And it's kind of ridiculous that you need to have some kind of guideline table to explain whether this product contains whole grains or not. And so just if you put yourself in a consumer's shoes, they're trying to make a purchasing decision. They've heard that you should be eating whole grains, and yet you're faced with this wall of different terminology that in some cases has been designed to be a bit tricky to decipher. You have to try and find out ways, how can this be made simpler? Because if we want people to make the right choices, if we want to encourage manufacturers to make foods that contain more whole grains, to spend time and money innovating on products which contain more whole grains yet still are widely sought after by consumers, you've got to think about the poor consumer at the end. I mean, I go into shops and I get confused. This is what I've been working with, among other things, for the last 20 years. It is really confusing. We should not need to have these kinds of tables that explain that one of the food ingredients that we are told that we should be eating more of internationally to try and find the foods that contain lots of whole grains. It's ridiculous. So we need to have a clear definition which helps people and just remove some of that confusion. So then you've got the other end of the scale, though, is really as you know, what is a whole grain food product? And the Dutch, bless them, are often quite strict, and I love this wording. So this is a report from a few years ago now about Dutch consumer groups railing against misleading whole grain product claims. So in this case, a whole grain crisp bread that contained only 41 whole grain wheat flour. And the American Association of Cereal Chemists, they had an 8 grams whole grain per 30 grams of product as their definition. So it's around about 25% whole grain. And so this consumer advocate is saying that we should have harsher measures to ensure that consumers really know what they're eating. So they were advocating really that should have up no whole grain claims on anything that had less than 100 grams of 100% whole grains. And so you can automatically see that makes the whole thing very difficult, because a lot of people don't traditionally eat whole grains, and if you only can see whole grain labels on products with 100% whole grain, that could be quite a leap for those consumers to go to choose those kinds of products. So different perspectives, but it's interesting where you've got these sort of strict definitions and guidelines that there could potentially be seen to be an association with greater intake. So, for example, in the Netherlands, to label a bread as whole grain bread, you need to have 100% of the grain component of that bread as whole grain. And there they have intakes, depending on where you look, up to about 40 grams. Countries such as Denmark and Sweden, obviously higher. And then the United States, where you've got the whole grain stamp for 51% and greater, you're down at very low amounts of around 15 grams among the lower ones. So just raising that issue, the suggestion that maybe if it's easier to find whole grains and that you've got maybe a higher whole grain content, it might be useful to help people to eat more whole grains. But there are a lot of other factors that go into that. And so just if we look very briefly, sorry for the wall of text here, but if we look at different whole grain food definitions, so the Food and Drug Administration, they talk about 51% whole grain flour in a product, and this is interesting, is that the product should also be low in fat and salt. That's not a definition for a whole grain product, that's a definition for allowing a health claim to be made on that product based on the whole grain content. The American Association of Cereal Chemists International, 8 grams per 30 grams, around about 25%. The Whole Grains Council, talking about the ladder system, so trying to encourage both consumers to choose products, but also to get manufacturers to increase on a sort of stepwise basis, to increase the amount of whole grains in their products, and you can then put a higher amount on your product. So the HealthGrain Forum, which was the definition group which I was chairing, we had a lot of discussion around it. It was really, really complicated. But effectively, the product should contain more than 50% whole grains, but acknowledging that there are products which don't just contain cereals, at least 30% of the overall product needed to be whole grains. So again, just there are a lot of mixed products out there. But also that we were suggesting that the product should meet healthy food criteria, which again there's actually no internationally recognised healthy food criteria, but in a lot of countries there are generally accepted criteria for healthy foods. But the thing which we felt was the clearest is that you should actually communicate the percentage of whole grains in a product, so that if a consumer is looking at a product and they're comparing two different products, there should be a number there. This has got a higher number than that, therefore there is more whole grain, I should choose one with more whole grains, just to make that a lot easier. And then there's the Whole Grain Initiative, which is a global consortium which is really aiming to standardise a definition across the world, and that is going for that 50% whole grains as that threshold for labelling food as a whole grain food, and at least 25% on the front of pack to say whole grain, contains whole grains. So that just gives you a bit of a summary, but really behind it all is really trying to connect national nutritional guidelines to what people can find, but also to make it realistic that manufacturers can produce products which are still going to be sought after by consumers, because that's the price and taste are the number one drivers of why people choose food products. And so if it's not competitively priced or it's not attractive enough in terms of taste, it will never have mass penetration in terms of health. And so this just compares the different definitions. I think I'll just actually, just in interest of time, I'll skip through this because I think there's one really interesting thing that comes up, and that is whether you should include healthy eating criteria for whole grain claims. And so we've got some pictures here of different kinds of products. So if you've never thought it would be such a thing, but whole grain turkey corn dogs, whole grain chicken patty fritters, whole wheat gingerbread, and we've got made with 8 grams of whole wheat waffles. And it's actually easier to see on this package whole wheat than it is to actually see what this is. In terms of text, waffles is very small text. We've got whole wheat and whole grain very, very low, called out in a very high way. It is a question, I mean, these are innovative products. They would otherwise be made using refined grains. They're technically increasing whole grain content, but they're also foods that would probably be counted as being high in fat or high in sugar, and potentially, especially in this case, could be seen to be, I'm trying to think what the word is, not really greenwashing, which in terms of environmental claims, but brown washing doesn't sound very nice either. Whole grain washing a product so that you make it seem brown and healthy when in actual fact maybe it's not. So we've got here, these chicken patty fritters, they've got this whole grain stamp saying it contains a certain amount of whole grain. So certainly that will contribute, but is that really the sort of product that you want to be having a claim? So that's really a matter of credibility. And this is, I think, what a lot of consumer organizations, at least in Europe, have complained about, is this idea that you can just put a bit of whole grain into a product and use that healthy glow to increase your sales, versus increasing the diversity of whole grain foods, so that people can actually choose. They've got a greater choice. They can increase more whole grains, so increase the amount of whole grains they eat by choosing these products. And so really, I'm not sure if there's a good way to do this, or if it's just really a question that I'm going to throw out at you there, which is really, is it more important to have healthy food criteria so that you don't have whole grains plastered all over products which otherwise would be considered to be unhealthy? Or is it more important that people can just get whole grains from a diverse range of products? Does anyone have any thought about that? And this is where we get the awful thing about Zoom presentations is you don't get to have the audience interactivity. Nana, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I just alluded to Donna there in the chat. More whole grains. Yes, more whole grains, healthy food criteria. Yeah, I like the second line. For sure. But anyone should chime in, and you can just speak up too. Use the chat or speak up.
Yep. But that's really it's a conundrum. There's no right or wrong answer. I think it's just something which it's really important, because some people will think very strongly in one direction, others will think very strongly in another. Maybe a bit of both. Education is critical. That's a good point. Healthy food is very subjective. Oh, let's get into definitions of healthy food are not subjective at all. Very strict compositional criteria. But I can definitely see what you mean. More whole grains. I can say there's this definite trend here. And certainly placing restrictions could, someone might engage with the whole grain corn dog, but they might not engage with with 100% whole grain crisp bread. Delicious whole grains, there we go. Good stuff. So it's interesting to get those opinions and ideas, because these are the sort of things which people raise, and just to think about, should you be adding a bit of whole grain into something which is full of sugar or full of fat and calling it whole grain, or should there be some sort of limit? So there's a lot of different approaches, and carrot versus stick is sort of a classic analogy here. If you take that carrot approach, you say, okay, let's just not worry about healthy eating criteria. For example, it's encouraging for food manufacturers to really innovate. You've got lower amounts of whole grains to get people started. People who think, oh, I don't like eating something which has 100% whole grains. I'm never going to eat that, but I might try something that's got 10% or 20% whole grains. It's also cultural-wise, it becomes a lot more applicable. It's not as strict. And so again, if you go into countries where whole grains are the norm, you'll find more people would say they want to have stricter criteria because they're already used to eating lots of whole grains in their diet. And it's quite important to note that a lot of the data around whole grains and health has been done from these big epidemiological studies in the United States, where a lot of the products eaten probably have had fairly marginal or low amounts of whole grains. So, and yet the associations with whole grains and health have still been found. So, there's certainly a lot of points there to point for the carrot approach. But really it is around credibility and if you say, well, a whole grain product with a very high amount of whole grain, it's very unambiguous. You know what you're getting. There's no grey areas. This is what it is, and take it or leave it. But there's that major risk in an environment where there is a major gap between recommendations and what people actually eat, that whole grain is exclusive, and that only a few people actually eat products which become technically labelled as whole grain. So carrot and stick approach, and it probably really does depend a lot on which country it's most appropriate. So again, some people like carrots and some people like sticks. There needs to be a bit of flexibility. So one of the things that hasn't really come up too much is around scientific research, and that's because when you get to a point around definitions starts to become really around compromise and legalities and quite technical details. Really, just to briefly say, there is a definite role that a definition needs to be grounded in the science. But the problem is, of course, often you raise questions which have not been answered yet. And so you get lots of people sort of saying, well, I think and I understand this, and well, everyone that I know thinks that. We need to try and just be careful to sort of avoid those kinds of being swayed by those kinds of arguments. There is a real need to make sure that these definitions are based on proper research. That might be consumer surveys and that might be sort of epidemiological studies or other more detailed nutritional studies, but that needs to be based on science rather than just hearsay and what people think. Because you start talking to enough people from different places and people think lots of different things. So just a shout there for science in terms of definitions, because often it does get lost. And also, I think when it comes to being into definitions, you have to accept that you're never going to get the perfect solution. And so this sort of process is a very iterative process. And so we've come from an area where we know that whole grains are good for your health. This has led to some whole grain recommendations around the world. They're pretty scattered though. And from that, we've come up with the best possible whole grain food definition. But as these sorts of things get more traction and more people start eating more whole grains, more products get innovated and there's more scientific research done, you come up to the next level, et cetera, until we end up at the point where we actually have a pretty good definition, but it's a process that takes years and years and years. So in terms of a whole grain definition, we're very much at the very start. But this is really it's important to just keep in mind, as I say here, the eye on the prize. It's really around, with the reason why we're doing this, why we're focusing on it, why people even bother innovating to make whole grain products, is that we want to get people to eat more whole grains, because we know that whole grains are good for health. And so again, just sort of, I guess, illustrating this, but in a slightly different way, we can talk about where we've got a whole grain definition, albeit with some questions around it. We've agreed, so I haven't really talked about this, but the difference between dry weight and wet weight for definitions, because often food products will have a wet weight, and do you report on a wet weight basis or a dry weight basis? Foods, standard legislation suggests that labelling on food should be based on a wet weight basis, but that doesn't really work so well for cereal foods. We've argued for dry weight. And we've got some agreement around the proportion of whole grains to refined grains. But then we've got all these other questions that we still need to sort out. So what is acceptable in terms of processing? So there's some new research which suggests, for example, people with type 2 diabetes have a very different glycemic response depending on how finely milled whole grain products are. So there's no difference in people who don't have type 2 diabetes, but in those people who do have type 2 diabetes, they are having a much higher glucose spike from milled whole grain foods compared to foods where the grains are largely intact. Yeah, so that again, that just sort of adds a bit more nuance. We understand some things, but there are a whole lot of things we really don't understand. There has to be, of course, global acceptance. It's much easier for regulation if everyone is following more or less the same rules. And if you're going to export foods across borders, if the rules are the same, it's much, much easier. The different grains, I mean, we had the example of, say, quinoa or wheat. They're very, very different in terms of their composition as far as grains go. Should we be calling, or should we have this very broad definition of whole grains, which has lots of different kinds of grains within that, or should it be maybe grain-specific recommendations? As we talked about healthy food criteria, a lot of people are quite keen to include seeds and legumes and beans and things like that in a whole grain food definition, but they're actually quite different in terms of composition and the way that we eat them. But that's one that gets brought up every now and then. Again, linking to whole grains, objective measures to how do we actually measure whole grains? So as soon as you've got a definition, you actually need ways of checking it to make sure that people do as they're told. So we need to make sure that these tools are available. So a whole lot of questions that remain to be answered, and that there will be no simple answer. So just to finish up, we've got the Whole Grain Initiative that was mentioned at the start. So this is a first stab at trying to have a globally recognised whole grain definition, and they've avoided any of the sort of controversial things and just said, well, a whole grain food should contain at least 50% whole grains based on dry weight, but that you could mention whole grain on the front of a pack if you've got at least 25%. So again, trying to encourage manufacturers to play with whole grain, to increase the amount of whole grain, but having a quite clear criteria for when you can actually say that it is a whole grain food. So just the final question, they're just not really specifically related to this talk, but just in general, if you think that there'd be any ways that you can increase the number of people regularly eating whole grains in Colorado? Are there things that you think that could be done that would encourage people to eat more? What are the barriers?
Well, I would just throw in here, it's grain school.
Is it a barrier or a...
Yeah, grain school, very biased, but I know that for the academic students, and we will see, they have filled out many surveys this semester to, study themselves in whole grain consumption. So we will see if an intervention like grain school that has hands-on experience and knowledge building in various areas of the grain chain, if that, makes people eat more whole grains. Mm. We just have anecdotal information from 6 years of grain school. that people generally, learn so much and increase their knowledge and their familiarization that they do. But that's just my bias. So I let everybody else talk. There are a lot of dietitians in the room. So
I'll just mention a few of the comments have been made. So one is just around healthy foods versus not having any healthy eating criteria. It's interesting that the comment about products that were bought for a food bank, if they're unhealthy products contributing to, I guess, chronic disease later on versus people having something to eat now. I mean, that's quite an extreme example, but it's very real. I mean, that's you can argue that people need, probably the most important thing is that people need to eat. And the secondary consideration is really, should that food be healthy or not? And again, the example of trans fats, yes, exactly. It's a really good example where people have, through widespread information, people have understood that they should avoid trans fats. And so, that certainly could be reversed and made more positive, say, eat more whole grains. So whole grain flours are not so accessible to bakers. That's an interesting one. I don't know anything about that, if whole grain flours are hard to come by.
Yeah, Matt, can you talk about this a little bit? I saw that comment also. Very interesting.
My name is Liz, actually. I'm so sorry. I can't change the name on the Zoom user's profile I'm using, so I apologize for that. But yeah, just thinking about, I guess, accessibility of whole grain flours, also in just the whole kind of like ethos around baking. I worked in bakeries for a little while, and there was just kind of this push toward, the kind of refined white flour is the product that we know most how to use and is definitely the cheapest to access, and the whole grain, I would say the whole grain flour we were using at the time was not like that much more expensive, but we just weren't really like using recipes that were highlighting that type of grain. And so we just tended toward those more like white flour based recipes.
That's really interesting. I think you've touched upon that experience that you didn't use. Nobody really did it because nobody had really used it before, and so unless there's a real push to encourage people to develop products using whole grains, it's a really interesting take on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We've got go there. Go.
The expectation how a slice of bread should look like, from the crumb to the crust. I think that's maybe going hand in hand with the bakers here in the US, having a certain expectation how a bread should look like. When you look globally, there are so many different types of breads, and so of course we're dealing in each culture with a different type of issue related to increasing those whole grains. Yeah.
There's certainly, I think, if you look globally as well, you can see that there are lots of solutions and different techniques that have been developed over centuries, really, for how to deal with difficulties in processing cereal grains. So one I know, but from Sweden, is they actually will scald rye flour, because that helps to increase the raising of the flour when you're trying to make a loaf out of it, because otherwise rye doesn't really have the same type of gluten as wheat, so it doesn't hold the bubbles during the fermentation as well. But by just using the scalding process, you can actually improve the leavening qualities of rye flour. So there's lots of these sort of traditional techniques which increase the variety, but then it gets a question of whether consumers are after variety, and that's sort of against that challenge, as you say, getting people used to the idea that bread should look like something else than what they've always seen. So certainly it's interesting. Education and awareness, local businesses, home bakers. Do a lot of people bake at home or not, or is that's quite niche? Or has that changed during the last couple of years?
I would say it has changed. Yeah, it has changed for sure. Yeah, there's probably a lot of people online here who are home bakers and baking their own bread. And there's definitely been a surge with COVID-19. Yeah.
Yes,
I also just wanted to jump in. Alastair just mentioned, just this conversation makes me think of some of the debates around salt. In an interesting way, it's kind of the opposite. We're talking about adding in, not taking out. But the conversations about these large companies who have, for many years, had high sodium content in their foods, and realizing that they really didn't need it for anything. It didn't improve the taste. It was just this default that had existed from some, older recipes. So there was, I think, some campaigns from this, Center for Science and the Public Interest to ask some of these companies, can you just reduce the sodium in the product? And your question makes me think about, what about just elevating a bit? Maybe people don't need to know. It's like you always hear the lunchroom stories of, we added it in, the kids didn't really notice that the pizza crust had more, so I'm just kind of thinking about these, not to say trick people. I don't think that's what you have to do, but I think when people don't immediately have to change everything right away, it seems like you elevate from zero to something.
Yeah. Certainly that is a strategy. I know that it doesn't work for a lot of cereal products, but certainly for breakfast cereal, that's been a strategy that's been used by some of the major companies. General Mills, for example, in the US has actively done that, just creeping on a creeping level, and they flagged it on their products, but they started off just adding in some whole grains into their products. So some of their sort of, especially more, I guess, sugary products targeted at children, just increasing slowly the amount of whole grains and decreasing the amount of sugar, and that certainly is one strategy there. So just again, food for thought, and maybe actually acting locally and thinking locally is really the best way to go to try and increase the amount of whole grains, and hopefully backed up by sensible definitions. So just with that, just want to acknowledge some of the people that have worked with in the past on the issue of whole grain definitions, which it's quite a wide group of people from a number of different countries, although some glaring gaps in the world map of where people are engaged and involved. So yeah, just to finish up there, and just open up for any questions if anyone's got any questions or anything we might be able to help out with, or if you've got any ideas indeed how to solve the whole grain gap.
Yeah, questions, anyone? Feel free to unmute and speak on the microphone. Well, I'm going to kick it off. I always have questions. So, first of all, thank you very much. It's just amazing to me how much work that has gone into this, and yet you showed this progression, and we are still kind of at the level where we now have a globally, to be accepted globally defined whole grain situation. But we are not as far as I thought we were. And so I have a question that is probably an important one for all of us here online. And you mentioned it a couple of times. How do you measure whole grain in a recipe or in a food? In a recipe is probably pretty easy if you're a home baker, but in a food, how is that best measured?
That's a really good question, and it's a tough one. So it is suggested that you can just use the dockets of what's gone into the recipe, so what's gone into the mixer, and so that should be recorded. So for every batch, and so you can just go and look at the scale and go, yes, well, that matches, that's fine. Of course, that gets to be rather difficult once the product's been, it's if you cannot easily access that kind of information. And so there are some chemical methods which have been proposed, but there's no one universal method that really works for everything. So there's suggestions around dietary fibre. The compounds you mentioned before, alkylresorcinols, have been suggested, but they're only present in a certain number of cereal grains. So there's some quite complex methods that have been suggested, measuring sort of 10, 20 different kinds of very different components of cereal grains, but they'll give you a very detailed breakdown. But yeah, it is not very easy. And certainly to get to the point where you could say the difference between 50% and 45% becomes quite difficult. So really going back to tracing what has been put into the mixer in the first place is the most straightforward. But yeah, there are, whenever there is an issue, there's always going to be people working at trying to how to solve that. So I mean, there are a lot of imaging techniques and spectroscopic techniques that could be used, which are quite fast. They need a lot of training, but yeah, potentially could be used. But again, you can easily fool maybe those kinds of techniques by addition of colors. And so there's one baker's trick is to add caramel colouring into bread, and it has very nice loaf volume. It's all beautiful and puffy, but it looks brown, and therefore must be healthy. But it's got great sort of characteristics if you like refined bread. So there's lots of different tricks that are quite common, and finding ways to actually sort of define these things. And indeed, if it's worth the investment, how much global trade is really depends on a measurement for whole grains compared to say contaminants which will cause cancer. That's that sort of, you have to work out where you're going to put your prioritization.
Okay, thank you. There were some good questions here in the chat. Who loses with a unified definition of whole grains?
It's a good question. I don't think anybody loses, but I think people have different ideas. And so Europe has got a nice microcosm of diversity of opinions, and whole grains mean very different things to different people there. And you are literally going, in Spain, visiting there and trying to find anything with whole grain, and I couldn't find anything. Whereas if you're in Finland, at the other end of the spectrum, pretty much everything has whole grain rye flour in it. It's just ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And so I guess it's that classic thing where you sit down and people are effectively talking different languages when they're talking about cereal products. And so getting people to agree to something from very, very different starting points is quite tricky. So I don't think anybody loses, but I think many things are lost in translation.
There's also a question about, what about the role of increasing whole grain through cooking grains? And I assume that you're referring to soups and grain bowls and things that we're going to look at with menus of change. Are those ways to increasing whole grains?
Absolutely. There's a lot of innovation going around those kinds of areas. So you can get barley and oats, for example, which have been processed so that they are effectively a bit like risotto rice. So you can make rice-based dishes except out of whole grain oats or whole grain barley. And I think something like quinoa as well is also a nice example where that's been added into a lot of different sort of main meal kind of dishes. And obviously pasta is also a very good source of whole grains. And when if it's done well, you cannot really tell the difference. If it's done badly, you can really tell the difference. If you have that sort of whole grain pasta which falls apart, and certainly is not al dente, it's not a pleasant experience, but some companies do that very well. And again, that can be just if you're mixing different kinds of some refined flour with whole grain flour, that can be a good solution. So no, absolutely, there's a lot to be done. And you mentioned soups, but also things like drinks, cereal-based drinks and porridges, which maybe not so common in a lot of countries. But if you go into Asia, I think congis and these sorts of things are quite a popular cereal-based foods, which are really just sort of types of porridge, but there's a lot of different things you can do with the porridge to make it more appealing and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we've got a really good question here about the benefit versus cost of taking off that 1%. I think you'd have to ask a miller, really. I think the cost for in a modern mill is very low because it's all automated. And I had this experience once when I tried to do a clinical trial and suggested to one of my colleagues that we just use uncooked flour, and he took me inside and said, Alistair, you do realise that between the field, which is full of rats and birds and pesticides and herbicides and everything like that, and dirt and stones, and the mill, there is absolutely no cleaning process. So there is a huge amount of rubbish which is on the outside of a cereal grain. And so that process to just remove that outer layer is not only removing components which have sort of penetrated that very surface of the grain, but it's also the stuff that's on the surface of the surface. And it's dirty. In terms of health cost, which I get, it all comes into it because obviously you don't want people to get sick from those contaminants. So I mean, again, if you have bird poo or heavy metals and those sorts of things, there is a significant health cost. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with ergotism, which is a fungus which penetrates the outer layers of the rye grain. And so there used to be this case where people would eat rye bread and they'd go mad, and that was implicated in several witch trials. And the fungus itself was, it's only in the outer layer. So milling is actually one way of getting rid of potential contamination from that fungus. I think the other esoteric thing there is that one of the active ingredient in ergotism from the fungus is the same as LSD, but that's a digression. So there's I think there is a lot of value in getting rid of that, and I think it's just a matter of that outer 1%. It's a matter of just being honest, and I think there is this idea that if you have fine, nice stone milled flour and that's whole grain, that's all very good, but the reality is if you've just got industrial scale milling, it needs to be, there needs to be a way of taking care of those kinds of contaminants. Farming practices and soil health, are they included as criteria in stating that whole grains are criteria? No, absolutely not. There's no relationship between farming practices and any kinds of criteria. As far as I'm aware, I don't think there's been anything, for example, comparing organic versus conventionally farmed wheat. Again, when you get into these things, it's like a Medusa. You answer one question and 7 more questions pop up. And certainly, just my current work, there are a lot of questions around farming practices and agricultural products and sustainable, whether there's an improvement in agricultural product quality due to sustainable farming practices. And I see Erin has just mentioned there that there's a lot of research happening in the area. There've been people comparing composition of conventional versus organic. One that comes to the top of my head is sort of milk and tomatoes. And the research is very mixed. Sometimes it's resoundingly maybe, and other times it's no. I think there's probably one of the things which is good about cereal-based foods in general is that they are sustainable. You can feed a lot of people off a hectare or an acre of grain compared to if you've got animals grazing on it, or using that feed to feed animals which you then eat. So there's a lot of very good sustainable arguments for eating more cereal-based foods. And obviously, if those agricultural practices are done in a way which is sustainable, that's already very good. But in terms of whether that leads to improved health effects, I just don't think there's enough information to be able to say that yet. So again, these are good questions to ask when you're thinking about research projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one more and then we'll let you go unless there's something else coming through. But because we have so many dietitians, mainly the UCCS students and health professionals and that are looking at diets of people, how is whole grain evaluated in the diets of people? What would you recommend? I know it's very complex, but what would you recommend as sort of a solid entry point?
It's a really good question because it's not easy, and we go back to the diversity of cereal products. You really need to have a good idea about what's available. And so it's interesting to go and have a look at the Harvard Food Frequency Questionnaire, which is this instrument which has been used to assess diet in, say, millions of American people. And this is the basis of dietary guidelines across the world. There's really, and whole grain intake is assessed through about 5 questions regarding, do you eat, how many times the last year have you eaten whole grain bread, and then you sort of tick a box saying if it's several times a day, once a day, a few times a week, etc., through to never. And the same sort of question might be for porridge, and it might be for breakfast cereals, and then you have to write down what breakfast cereal you normally eat. So it's a very blunt tool, and it doesn't really capture the breadth and diversity of grain foods. So I think what it might be segueing to is whether you need to have a specialised food frequency questionnaire or diary. As the dietitians will probably learn or have already learned, food diaries are horrible when you've got to sit down and manually enter all the information. Obviously easier if you can do that electronically. But again, you then have to go and find out the composition of different brands of foods that have been entered. So it's got its own problems, because obviously it's much easier to get people to fill out a questionnaire that takes them half an hour versus a diary, which might take several days or 24-hour records. So it's all those pros and cons. Another way is, of course, using biomarkers of whole grain intake. And so there you just take a blood or a urine sample, and then you can measure compounds coming from the cereals in the blood or the urine. A whole lot of complexities there, but it's quite independent of the measurement errors you get in food recall or food diaries. So that's really quite critical. That if you've got a few different measurement instruments, you can get much better ideas about whole grain intake. But one of the things which has always surprised me is if you go to the United States, you'll see there's lots of whole grain products out there, and they wouldn't be in the shelves if nobody was buying them. That's the first law of the market, is that if it doesn't sell, it won't be there. And so clearly people are buying them, but the measures of whole grain intake in the United States suggest they're quite stubbornly low. And the first health claims for whole grains came out in 2001. So there's been a surge of whole grain products since then. So clearly somebody's buying them, but for some reason it's not really been captured in the national surveys. So certainly it's an interesting one to try and examine, and I think taking that maybe more localized approach could be quite a useful way of examining that.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite amazing. We have used the survey, the whole grain frequency questionnaire that Dr. Ross developed in Switzerland. So we adapted it to the US, and the students have filled it out, and I'm trying to analyze it now, which is another very difficult endeavor to figure out how to analyze this. So it seems so simple, this whole grain discussion, and yet it is so complex. Yeah.
It's just a microcosm for, I think, a lot of the issues around food in general in terms of measuring intake and legislation and definitions. I think for there to be an agreement on dietary fibre, I think for a definition of dietary fiber, took over 30 years. So you can imagine if that's spanning an entire working career almost. These things take time.
Well, we thank you very much for sharing, your knowledge, this rich knowledge on whole grains, and I'm sure everybody learned a lot today. And we will let you go so that you can finish your day in New Zealand, I think, and then get into the weekend while we are struggling one more day.
Well, I hope it's a very good day, and I hope you. It sounds like a great grain school. So enjoy that, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, and join us next week. If you like.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.